This is Dr. Thomas Mueller. Thought I'd read to you today just a bit of an introduction from my latest Photos in Motocross book available on Amazon. This is the second edition. The story has its start in early 1970s. I grew up in central Wisconsin. That means 4 to 5 months of good weather. Then the rest is thin sledding and below zero temperatures. Amidst this environment, I became obsessed with motorcycles, especially motocross racing. Only God knows that when I attended church with my family each Sunday, thoughts in my head were not of the holy. Instead, I was replaying images in my mind from the latest MX magazines again and again. This was not a normal path for me to follow. I had no background in motorcycles and no one in my family was involved. My dad bought me a Honda S90 from an employee at his feed mill. I rode that bike around the property for several weeks before someone told me that after I left the clutch out, there was a shifter near my foot. So my riding progressed to 3 additional options available in gearing. I was not talented on a motorcycle. I was born with inhibitions, something inside me that put a limit on the risk meter. I just couldn't hold the throttle open. Call it self-preservation, but surely not good for wicking it up over a blind jump. I remember a Baltaco 125 Alpina, TM 125 Suzuki, a TS 185 Suzuki, 250 radial head Mako, and a 250 Triumph Trophy. Bikes weren't the issue, I was. Riding around close to last in C motos was an indicator I had better earn my living writing about racing than being the man behind the handlebars. Onward to university, I attended my local community college for 2 years, then transferred to the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire. I was never much for courses that I could not see as applicable and relevant. But when it came to practical courses like news writing and photography, I excelled. I loved it when I could produce a crisp, well-written story. And photography allowed the opportunity to explore not only sport imaging, but also nature and studio photography work. I became an assistant in the university photo lab, spent many hours in the dark room developing black and white film, then experimenting with the exposure and printing of images onto photo paper. Exceptional care went into presentation of my work. Much of my education at university came through self-study. I sat in the back row in lecture halls reading motocross magazines. The MX mags were interesting and surely desired, but there was a problem. They were all things California, and to a fledgling competitor far to the east, it might have been Mars. That made it hard to relate. It was the publication Cycle News that changed my life. I first saw this weekly tabloid when hanging around with some of my enduro riding friends. It was the publication for serious competitors, those who wanted to stay aware of the latest news in the world of racing. I bought a subscription and took it with me everywhere. You didn't gulp down the information, rather you tasted every sweet page, just like fine wine. Cycle News had an East Coast edition. This meant all races east of the Mississippi River were given special consideration. I could go to the back of each issue and search for short race reports coming out of tracks such as Black Bear MX in my area, Ascalon down toward Milwaukee, or some of the tracks in Illinois. Who didn't get a rush when they saw their name or photo in a local race report? It was a time without social media to shout one's own accolades. When you had your name or photo published in Cycle News, it was truly valued. How reinforcing it was to know someone cared about remote locations in the Midwest. No, we weren't California bred, but we loved racing just the same. The Cycle News East staff coined the iconic, "We don't care how the hell they do it in California." A catchphrase that endured for decades was born. This is where my progress of transitioning to a moto journalist began. While a professor was lecturing on the finer points of biology, I was studying in my own way, reading each race feature again and again, understanding the structure in news reporting, where the facts went, and how to interject quotes from riders to bring life to the copy. There was a consistent form and style, a standardized way of delivering information to precious readers each and every week. I began to understand what it meant to bear the great responsibility of serving as the eyes and ears for subscribers everywhere. Storytelling through clear writing and associated imaging was expected. Can you recall ripping into the latest edition of Cycle News? The power of imagination and association would bring great pleasure in our experience. Let me shorten this up and get to what you care about most. The photos in this book. I had been taking race photos at local events, then souping the black and white film and making glossy 8x10 prints. When I saw the ad in Cycle News for an assistant editor, I typed up a cover letter, stuck some of my best pics in the envelope, and mailed it off to editor Jack Mangus in Tucker, Georgia, a suburb of Atlanta. We talked on the phone a couple of times, and he told me I had the job. And also, to the best of my memory, I was the first student in my graduating class at university to secure employment with one of the best organizations in racing. There was no time for graduation ceremonies. That was acceptable for some, but I had a new job and calling to go on the national MX circuit. First things first, wouldn't you say? I packed up a U-Haul and drove south, headed for one of the greatest adventures of my lifetime. A short comment here on my role in the racing industry. I'd realized years prior that I didn't have the inherent skills and courage necessary to be a competent racer, much less a professional. However, I held a different sort of courage. The type that allows you to leave your homes and friends and geographic comfort zone to find a new place and purpose. I took my responsibility as a moto journalist seriously. I had studied hard, well, the news and photo parts, and I was ready to use my education to spread the word of racing to readers everywhere. That meant doing my best to tell the truth in reporting, to set aside bias when I crafted the copy. That's not easy, and I'm not perfect. The intent was always there to treat everyone fairly and with respect. I worked for Cycle News from 1979 through 1982. During those years, I traveled with 2 camera bodies, shooting film for both the East and West Coast edition. West Coast film had to be delivered to the airport and put on a Delta Dash flight for pickup in Los Angeles. I covered most of the East Coast national motocross races, plus many additional events and other forms of motorcycle competition. I also greatly enjoyed interviewing top racers and industry executives. Sometimes it was a one-page filler interview that was placed strategically to complete an issue going to press. On other occasions, it was more extensive hanging out feature. I love those the most, getting into the racer's home environment and then giving readers an inside view of their lives and activities. Most of the photography was black and white. I used Kodak Tri-X, ASA 400 film, pushed to 1600 in the development process for Supercross events. When a roll is developed, the negatives are exposed onto a contact sheet and a photo paper. The negatives were then placed in a wax sleeve and taped to the back of the contact sheet. Cycle News allowed us to retain ownership of those images. Those negs and contact sheets traveled with me for decades to come, packed in a plastic storage tub. Those negatives are precious to me. Years ago, I learned a hard lesson. A magazine wanted to use some of my photos for a feature, and I mailed out a few contact sheets. I never got them back. When I asked, they were lost or displaced, or possibly stored in someone else's collection. No one cares about your possessions as you might care about them yourself. More recently, a good friend took it upon herself to take each negative strip, then one by one scan the images into digital form. I now have thousands of accessible images to use in my social media and in this book. I did an initial quick view of my images when I published my first American Motocross in Photos in 2013. It remains available for sale on Amazon, so search for it there and buy a copy to set the stage for this latest edition. Please let me comment on the first motocross book. Based on reviews, customers either loved it or not so much. Some were truly appreciative of the images I provide, while others stated an old MX mag is a better deal. My rationale was that for the cost of a craft beer, you can access these images. I believe what I have to offer has value, but I don't want to oversell it. The dimensional format of books is tricky and important. For the first edition, I went with a vertical format book, which allowed for many facial personality images. However, the vertical format is not conducive to most racing shots, which is the essence of my photography. For this new 2020 edition, I went with Amazon's only horizontal landscape option, 8.5 by 6 inches. Please let me share a few details regarding the development of the second edition. This is a random selection of images. I have thousands of images. Images are not cataloged or marked, and I don't have a perfect recall in what I'm seeing in some of these images. David Bailey, by the way, has almost perfect memory. You can always ask him. I have 12 albums of images collected at random associations. What you have in this edition is some images selected from two of the 12 albums. I was selecting as I went, doing some minimal touch-ups and cropping before setting each image aside for the publication. This book is not representative of my overall work. If I sell enough copies of the second edition, I might follow up with a third. There's plenty more where that came from. Okay. Most of these images have never been published. I came upon some, I saw them, I get tired of giving them away on social media. It's better to market them to paying customers like you. Bottom line, these are some of the greatest selections of outtakes you will find from racing in the specified years. Okay. I took some liberties in this book. Not all of the images are MX related. Some were just really interesting shots that I found, personality pieces from other types of racing. So please, bear with me. Cycle News was a holistic experience. It was important that I have the freedom to express myself through the photos I choose to share. Book's homemade. I did it myself. I created a lot of the imaging and graphics. A bit of tech background. My images are stored in one of my Google accounts. I bring them into Google Photos, and then I use a photo editing tool to clean some of them up. Okay. You need to savor this book. Getting the most from American motocross, you must leave some of the world of social media behind. The flicking of the thumb, the endless scrolling, more and more, it never stops. Your mind numbs. Here, slow down, imbibe in the images as if you were sipping a fine glass of wine or whiskey. Savor the flavor, go slow. Okay? You may spot mistakes. My memory's far from perfect. In some of the images, I can't remember the riders in context. There may be a few typos, though I've checked many times. Okay? I'll conclude with a short story related to the content in this book. In 1983, I started my own PR firm, subcontracted to the Wrangler brand. We were promoting a sponsorship of the 1983 Wrangler Super Series, the apparel brand's attempt to bring Supercross and National Motocross together in one championship. I worked for a PR visionary named Joe Whitlock, lead publicist at Daytona International Speedway. Later, Dale Earnhardt's lead frontman at the races. Story goes, Joe was giving an individual some race tickets for a NASCAR event. The individual who took those tickets didn't always appreciate or respond well for the free tickets. One day, Joe went into this individual's men's apparel store. He picked up 3 or 4 shirts and some nice ties and started walking out. The store owner was flabbergasted and wondered why Joe had not paid for the merchandise. Joe replied, "You've been taking what's mine and not paying for it for a long time. I thought it was time to come and take some of yours, of what's yours as a repayment." Here's the moral of the story. I wouldn't take what's yours without the proper permissions or without paying the proper fee for use. Please do not copy, scan, or photo reproduce images from my book and publish them elsewhere. The race credentials taken from Joe Whitlock had worth and value. The photo images in this book have worth and value to me as copyrighted property. I truly appreciate your understanding. Now let's get started on our journey exploring American motocross in photos.